Eli Weston rode into the valley of Harrow Creek on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1878 with nothing but a worn saddle, a tired roan mare, and a face that had been telling the wrong story for the past 3 years. The scar ran from just below his left eye all the way down to the corner of his jaw, a jagged line of puckered pink skin that caught the morning light and held it in a way that made strangers uncomfortable, made their eyes slide away before they could stop themselves. It was the kind of thing that invited questions no one actually wanted answered. He had stopped answering them anyway. It was easier to let people believe what they wished, and what they wished was always something terrible, a knife fight, a branding iron, a punishment he deserved. The truth was quieter and sadder than any of those things, but nobody in Harrow Creek knew that yet. He had heard about the valley from a man in Tucson who'd been half drunk on rye whiskey and full drunk on nostalgia, going on about the green grass and the good water and the ranches that stretched from the foothills to the river. He had said there was always work for a man who knew cattle. Eli knew cattle. He had grown up knowing cattle. He had spent the better part of his 28 years learning every mood a steer could carry and every trick a spooked herd could play. And there was not a man in the whole of the Arizona territory who could read the land from horseback the way Eli Weston could. But the land did not look back at him. People did. He tried the Barker Ranch first, because it sat closest to the road, and because the foreman, a wide man named Dutton, had been standing near the fence when Eli rode up, making conversation easy enough. Dutton had looked him over with the practiced squint of someone who hired and fired men for a living, and for just a moment Eli had thought he might have a chance. The man's eyes had been considering, not yet decided. Then they had traveled up to the scar and something had shifted, the way a door shifts just before it closes. "We're full up," Dutton had said, and turned back to the fence post he'd been leaning on as if Eli had already ridden away. He tried the Mercer spread next, and the Callaway outfit after that, and by the time the afternoon sun had flattened itself against the western hills, he had heard the same words enough times to have them memorized. "We're full up, can't use you, nothing here, friend." One woman at the Callaway place had not even come to the door, just called through the wood that they weren't hiring, though Eli could plainly see 3 men out in the yard doing work that a 4th pair of hands would have made easier. He camped that night by the creek, feeding the mare what little grain he had left, and eating a cold meal from a tin he did not taste, staring into a fire that gave off more light than warmth. The stars were enormous and indifferent. The coyotes called from somewhere up in the dark hills. He told himself he would try one more ranch in the morning, just one, and then he would move on. There was always another valley. There was always another road leading somewhere that had not seen his face yet. He almost did not stop at the Hawkins place. He almost rode past it entirely, because the morning was already sliding toward noon, and he had promised himself only one more attempt, and the Sutton Ranch had burned that promise to nothing with a closed gate, and a boy of maybe 16 sent out to tell him the boss was not available. He was tired in the way that goes deeper than sleep can fix, a tiredness that lives in the chest rather than the limbs, and the Hawkins land looked modest compared to the others. A proper house but not a grand one, a barn that needed some paint on the south side, fence lines running straight and true, but with a few posts that leaned at angles suggesting they had been waiting a while for someone to set them right. What made him stop was the cattle. A small herd, maybe 40 head, had bunched themselves against the far fence in a way that looked wrong. Not panicking, not sick, but something in between the restless circling of animals that had been spooked and had not yet decided what to do about it. He sat the mare on the road and watched them for a moment, reading what they were telling him, and what they were telling him was that something had come through in the night, probably a mountain lion working the edges, and this herd had been burning nervous energy since before sunrise and nobody had settled them yet. He looked at the house. He looked at the cattle. He rode through the gate. The woman who came out onto the porch when she heard him coming was not what he expected, though he could not have said exactly what he had been expecting. She was perhaps 25, with dark hair pinned back in a practical way that suggested she had more important things to think about than how it looked, and brown eyes that were sharp and direct without being unkind. She was wearing a plain work dress with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and a leather apron over the front that told him she had been doing something that required both hands. She came to the edge of the porch and stood there looking at him without the kind of hesitation that he had become accustomed to, without the moment of flinching calculation that he had learned to brace for. "You looking for work?" she asked, before he had even opened his mouth. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Can you ride?" "Yes, ma'am." "Rope?" "Yes, ma'am." "Read cattle?" That made him straighten slightly in the saddle. "Better than most," he said, and there was no boast in it, just the plain truth stated plainly. She looked at him for a long moment, and he made himself hold still for it, made himself not look away or angle his face so the scarred side was less visible. He was done with managing other people's comfort at the expense of his own dignity. She could look. She was looking. Her eyes moved across the scar without the flinch, without the slide, without the retreat he had grown so accustomed to, and then they moved on, the way a person's eyes move on when they have seen what they needed to see and found it neither surprising nor troubling. "Your cattle are bunched against the south fence," he said. "Something came through last night, probably a lion. They've been burning off the nervous energy all morning, and nobody's settled them. You let that go till afternoon. One of them will find a way through the fence, and then you'll be spending the rest of the week gathering." She turned her head and looked toward the south pasture, and even from where she stood on the porch, he could see that she was doing the quick mental calculation of someone who already knew he was right but needed a second to absorb it. Then she looked back at him. "You'll do fine," she said, and she meant it. He could hear that she meant it in the way the words sat in the air between them. Not a reassurance, not a performance of generosity, not the careful brightness of someone trying to prove they were not bothered by his face. Just a plain statement of her assessment, offered and left standing on its own. "Yes, ma'am," he said, though something in his chest had shifted in a way he was not entirely prepared for. "There's a bunk in the barn until we work something out. Wages $11 a month plus meals. I don't cheat on the meals and I don't tolerate cheating on the work. My name is Caroline Hawkins. What's yours?" "Eli Weston." "All right, Eli Weston," she said, and turned back toward the house. "Go settle my cattle." He went and settled her cattle. It took him the better part of 2 hours, working the mare in patient circles at the edges of the herd, making his presence known without making it threatening, letting the animals hear the steady rhythm of hooves and the low sounds he made from the back of his throat that meant nothing in particular to anyone else, but seemed to communicate something important to nervous livestock. By the time the sun had moved past its peak, the herd was spread out and grazing in the easy, purposeless way that meant they had stopped worrying about whatever had spooked them in the night. When he rode back toward the barn, there was a boy standing at the fence watching him. The boy was young, maybe 10 or 11, with his mother's dark hair, and a face that had not yet decided what it was going to look like in 20 years. He was watching Eli with open curiosity, the kind that children carry before the world has taught them to hide it, and his eyes traveled over the scar with the frank, clinical interest of someone encountering something new and interesting rather than something alarming. "Did you know a mountain lion can jump 15 feet straight up from a standing position?" the boy said. Eli brought the mare to a stop. "Is that right?" "I read it in a book. It's an old book, but the mountain lions probably haven't changed much since it was written." "Probably not," Eli agreed. "My name is James. My mama is Caroline Hawkins, but you probably already know that because she told you. I'm not supposed to be out here by myself because there might still be a mountain lion around, but I can see the barn from the kitchen window, and I thought that was close enough." Eli looked at the barn and then at the kitchen window and decided that was probably a reasonable interpretation of the rule. "Where's your father?" he asked, because the question needed to be asked if he was going to understand the situation here. James's expression did not collapse, but something moved behind his eyes, a practiced steadiness that was too old for his face. "He died 2 winters ago," the boy said. "Fever. It wasn't the exciting kind of dying, just the slow kind." "I'm sorry," Eli said, and he meant that too. "Mama says we're doing fine. She means it when she says things like that. She doesn't say things she doesn't mean." Eli looked at the house and then back at the boy. "Go on inside," he said. "I'll check the perimeter of the property before dark. Make sure your lion has moved on." James looked at him with the evaluating gaze of a child who is deciding whether to trust someone. Whatever he found must have satisfied him, because he nodded once, the way his mother had nodded when she'd made her assessment, and went back toward the house with his hands in his pockets. The bunk in the barn was clean, and the blanket was thick, and the supper that appeared on a tray outside the barn door that first evening was more substantial than Eli had expected: salt pork and beans and cornbread with real butter, and a small tin pot of coffee that was still hot enough to matter. He ate sitting in the barn doorway, watching the stars come out over the valley, and thinking about the way Caroline Hawkins had looked at him on the porch, the way her eyes had moved across his face, and found it neither remarkable nor troubling. Just a face with a story in it that she had not yet asked to hear. He did not know what to do with that. He had spent 3 years managing the story that Scar told before he even opened his mouth. 3 years of watching the calculation happen in people's eyes, watching them decide he was dangerous or damaged or both. 3 years of ranchers who didn't hire him and towns that didn't warm to him and women who found reasons to be elsewhere when he came near. He had built a careful life inside all of that, a life that required very little from anyone else and offered very little in return, and it had been a perfectly functional life. Lonely, yes. Quiet in ways that went past comfortable, but functional. He was not prepared for someone to simply look at him and say you'll do fine and mean it. He was especially not prepared for the way that simple, practical sentence had opened something in his chest like a window being pushed up on a warm morning, letting in air that he had forgotten could smell like that. He went asleep telling himself it was just a job. He woke up at 5 in the morning and went to work, because that was what the job required, and that was what he was. The ranch showed him its troubles in the first week the way a book shows you its story, not all at once, but steadily, page by page, each thing revealing the next. The south fence needed more than a few posts set right. It needed 3 full sections rebuilt, where the posts had rotted through at the base and been propped up with whatever was at hand. The water trough in the north pasture was losing more water than it should, and needed its boards stripped and resealed. 2 of the cows were showing signs that they had not been properly attended during the last round of calving and needed to be watched. There was a lean-to on the west side of the barn that had half collapsed under the weight of winter snow and had been left in its broken state because, he was coming to understand, there had been nobody to fix it. He fixed things. That was what he knew how to do. He rose before the sun and worked until the light failed. And when the light failed, he sat in the barn doorway, and sometimes James came out and talked to him about things he had read in books, which covered an astonishing range of subjects for a boy his age. He learned that James was reading everything in a box of books that had belonged to his father, working through them in order, and that the box included everything from a volume on natural history to a novel about a count in a French prison, to a worn Bible, to a collection of speeches by men whose names Eli recognized but whose words he had never heard. "Do you read?" James asked him one evening. "Some," Eli said. "Enough to get by." "My father read a great deal," James said. He said it was how a man prepared for conversations he hadn't had yet. Eli thought about that. Smart man. "Mama misses him," James said, with the directness of a child who has not yet learned to dress up difficult truths in comfortable clothing. "She doesn't say so much, but I can tell. She works very hard so she doesn't have time to be sad about it during the day, but sometimes at night I hear her sitting on the porch and she's very quiet, and that's when she misses him." Eli said nothing, because there was nothing to say to that would not be either intrusive or dishonest. "She works too hard," James continued, with the judicial air of someone handing down a verdict. She's the one who's been keeping everything going. Before you came, she was doing nearly everything herself except when the Mullins boy came over on Saturdays to help with the heavy things. The Mullins boy, Tommy Mullins, he's 16. He's strong, but he doesn't know cattle the way you do. He told me once that a heifer is the same as a cow, but I told him that wasn't exactly right and he didn't take it well. Eli almost smiled. It was a strange feeling, like a muscle that had been unused for long enough that using it again required intention. "Go inside," he said. "It's getting cold." Caroline herself was a more complicated subject. She came to the barn each morning to discuss the day's work with him in a brisk, practical way, standing with her arms crossed and her eyes on the pasture or the fence line or whatever they were talking about, never on him for longer than necessary. She gave her assessments plainly and listened to his without either dismissing them or accepting them automatically, which told him she was someone who thought for herself. She paid attention to everything. She knew which cow had been off her feed for 2 days, and which post in the east fence had been wobbling longer than she'd meant to let it, and exactly how much hay was left in the loft, and how long it needed to last. She was also, he noticed in the careful peripheral way that he had learned to notice things, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with being showy about it. She was beautiful the way a well-kept piece of land is beautiful, in the way that comes from something real and sustained rather than from effort. He told himself this was an observation and not a feeling. He was quite practiced at this particular form of self-deception, and it served him reasonably well for the first 2 weeks. The 3rd week, she brought him his supper herself instead of leaving it on the tray. He was in the barn working on a piece of harness by lantern light when he heard the door and looked up, and there she was, carrying a covered plate in both hands, picking her way through the dark between the door and the lantern with the careful surety of someone who knows her own property well. "James is asleep," she said, by way of explanation. "I didn't want to leave this outside in case it attracted attention." The mountain lion, he understood. "Thank you," he said, and moved to take the plate from her. She sat down on a hay bale rather than leaving, which surprised him enough that he was 2 full seconds deciding what to do about it. He sat down across from her with the plate, and she folded her hands in her lap and looked at the harness he had been working on. "That's good work," she said. "My husband bought that harness in '73. It's been needing attention for a while." "It'll last another 5 years with the right care," he said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at her hands. Then she looked up at him directly, in the way she had on the porch that first day, and he made himself be still for it. "Where did you work before this?" she asked. He told her, in the economical way he had developed for this question. Wyoming for 2 years, on a spread called the Double C. Before that, New Mexico. Before that, Texas, where he had grown up on a ranch outside San Antonio that belonged to a man named Cartwright who had treated his hands decently and paid a fair wage. He had been a good hand and had known it, and the knowing had given him a confidence that he was still, 3 years later, trying to reconstruct from pieces. "And before here," she asked. "You came from the South?" "Tucson," he said. "For a few months, before that moving around." She heard the shape of the thing he was not saying. He could tell by the small shift in her expression, the slight softening. "The other ranches turned you away," she said. "It was not quite a question." "Yes, ma'am." "Because of your face?" He looked at her steadily. "Yes, ma'am." She absorbed this in the unhurried way she absorbed most things. "That's their foolishness," she said, and there was nothing performative about it, no particular heat, just the plain verdict of a woman who had thought about it and come to a conclusion. "Anyone who knows cattle can see what you can do in an afternoon. I'd rather have a man who can read a herd than a man with a pretty face who can't tell a spooked steer from a sick one." He did not know what to do with this either. He found that, with her, he was very often not knowing what to do with things, and that the not knowing was not as uncomfortable as it had been with other people. With other people, being off balance felt like a danger. With her it felt like something else, something he did not have a word for yet. "Your husband," he said, because the subject had been hovering and it seemed better to approach it directly. "How long did he work this ranch?" 6 years, she said. He bought the land in 1872, right after we married. He had a vision for it. Not a grand vision, not an empire-building sort of man, but a steady one. He knew what he wanted and he worked toward it every day. She paused. He was a good man. I don't say that only because he's gone. I said it when he was alive too. I believe you, Eli said. She looked at him for a moment. What happened to your face? She asked. Not with the prurient hunger that some people brought to the question, not with the careful tiptoeing of someone trying to ask without seeming to ask, but in the direct way she asked everything, as if the information were simply something she wanted and she saw no reason not to say so. He had a practiced answer for this question. He had used it so many times it had become almost automatic, a story stripped of all the particular pain it contained, rendered into something he could hand to someone without bleeding on them. He started to give it to her. Then he stopped. He looked at her sitting on the hay bale in the lantern light, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes on his face with that particular quality of attention that took things in without flinching and did not use what it found against you, and he thought that she deserved the real version. Fire, he said. 3 years ago, on the Double C, one of the bunkhouses went up in the night. There were men inside. I got 3 of them out. He stopped because even after 3 years the next part lived in a different place than words like to go. I couldn't get the 4th one out. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. She let it sit there without filling it. I went back in, he said. For the 4th man, I knew the roof was going to come down and I went back in anyway. I didn't get him out. The roof came down. I got myself out barely, and this, he touched his face briefly without drama, is what being nearly in the wrong place at the wrong time looks like. And the 4th man, she asked. He didn't make it. She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, you went back in. Yes. For a man you probably couldn't save. I didn't know I couldn't save him until I'd tried. She looked at him for a long moment, and in the lantern light her eyes were very dark and very direct, and he felt that she was seeing something more than she had been able to see in the daylight on the porch, something that the telling of this story had uncovered in him that the daylight kept covered. I'm glad you got out, she said, simply and entirely. And then she stood up, smoothed her apron, and said, I'll need you to look at the north pasture fence in the morning. I think there's a section that's giving way past where you've already worked. I'll look at it first thing, he said. She went back to the house. He sat in the barn with his cold supper and the lantern and the harness, and thought that something had changed, though he could not yet name what. Spring deepened into something that felt like a promise. The valley filled up with the soft, rolling green that the rains brought down from the mountains, and the cattle fattened on good grass and moved with the easy deliberateness of animals that have everything they need. Eli worked through each day with the focused attention he always brought to physical labor, but something was different now, some quality of care that went past what the job required, something he recognized after a while as investment. He was invested in this particular piece of land, in this particular herd, in these particular fence lines and water troughs, and the paint that was needed on the south side of the barn. He bought the paint out of his first month's wages without telling anyone about it. On a Saturday afternoon when there was no other pressing work, he simply started painting the barn, and James came out and asked what he was doing, and then picked up the second brush, and painted alongside him for 2 hours with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of a boy who enjoys most things he tries. Caroline came to the barn door mid-afternoon and stopped when she saw the fresh white paint going up the south side, and something moved across her face that was not quite surprise and not quite something else and was, in the end, just feeling, unguarded and briefly visible. You didn't have to do that, she said. The wood was starting to dry out, he said. Would have been a problem in another year. She looked at the paint and then at him and then at James, who was managing a brush approximately 4 times larger than was ideal for his size and was getting excellent coverage despite this. James, she said, don't get it on your shoes. Too late, James said cheerfully. She went back inside, but through the kitchen window, Eli caught the shape of her smile, and it did something to his morning that he was going to have to reckon with eventually. Eventually arrived sooner than he expected. It arrived on a Saturday in late May in the form of a man named Gerald Voss, who rode up to the Hawkins property in the mid-morning looking like someone who expected to be received with enthusiasm. He was perhaps 40, broad through the shoulders, with the look of a man who had made money and wanted others to know it. He tied his horse at the gate with the ease of someone who had done it before, walked to the porch with the ease of someone who considered himself welcome, and called Caroline's name in a tone that managed to be both friendly and proprietary. Eli was working on the north fence and had a clear line of sight to the porch. He was not watching, but he was aware, the way he was always aware of what was happening on this property now, an alertness that had become second nature. Caroline came out and greeted the man in the polite, contained way she greeted most people, pleasant but measured, giving nothing away. The man, Voss, did most of the talking. He gestured broadly at intervals, the gestures of someone laying out a proposal. Caroline listened with her arms crossed and her weight balanced, a posture Eli had come to recognize as her thinking posture, the one she used when she was taking something in and reserving judgment. After perhaps 20 minutes, Voss rode away. That evening, when Eli came in from the last rounds of the day, James was sitting on the porch step doing something to a piece of rope that was intended to be a knot but was becoming something more structurally creative. Eli sat down beside him and looked at the rope. "Mr. Voss wants to buy the ranch," James announced, without preamble. Eli kept his eyes on the rope. "Is that so? He's been wanting to buy it for a year. He says it adjoins his property and it would make sense. Mama says the price he's offering is lower than the land is worth, and she doesn't see why she would sell for less than what something is worth." "Your mother is right," Eli said. "She's usually right," James agreed. He pulled the rope tighter and achieved something that was at least vaguely knot-like. "He also thinks she can't run it alone. He said that to the Barker man, and the Barker man told Tommy Mullins, and Tommy Mullins told me. Mr. Voss thinks a woman alone can't keep a ranch going, and that eventually she'll have to sell to someone, and he'd rather it be him." Eli said nothing. "He's wrong," James said with the flat certainty of a boy reporting an established fact. "Mama's been keeping it going. She kept it going all through the winter when it was just her and Tommy Mullins." "She has," Eli said. James looked at him sideways, the way children look at adults when they are sizing up whether to say the next thing. Whatever he decided, it was apparently yes. "I think she keeps it going because it was Papa's dream too," he said. "Not just because she's stubborn, though she is, but because the ranch was something they built together, and selling it would be like letting go of something she's not ready to let go of." Eli looked at the boy for a moment. "You're very observant," he said. "I read a lot," James said. "You learn to pay attention to things." He went inside a few minutes later, leaving Eli sitting on the porch step in the evening quiet. After a while Caroline came out, which was not her habit, and sat in the chair at the end of the porch and looked out over the pasture in the particular way she had of looking at it, as if she were checking something against an interior image she carried. "James tell you about Voss?" she asked. "Some," he said. "He's been after this land for a while," she said. "He's not a bad man, exactly. He just has the kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no in a way that stuck." "You considering it?" he asked. He was careful with his voice, keeping the question neutral. She turned and looked at him. "No," she said. "This is my land. Daniel put everything into this land and James grew up on it, and I'm not selling it to Gerald Voss or anyone else." She paused. "But I'm also not foolish enough to think Voss isn't going to keep trying. Men like that tend to think patience is a strategy." "It is," Eli said. "But so is making the thing they want clearly not available." She looked at him for a moment, and he thought she was going to say something. But instead she looked back at the pasture, and the moment passed, and they sat in the evening quiet together for a while longer before she went in to put James to bed. He thought about what James had said about her sitting on the porch at night being quiet. He thought about Daniel Hawkins, and the dream they had built together, and the fever that had ended it on one side, and left the other to carry it forward alone. He thought about carrying things alone. He had considerable experience with that particular weight. June arrived with heat and a dry wind from the south and a problem. The problem came in the form of 2 of Eli's cattle readings being confirmed in a way that was not pleasant. The cows he had flagged in his first week, the ones showing signs of poor calving care, had not improved as he had hoped with the better pasture and attention. One of them was clearly not going to make it, and the other needed a treatment that required supplies Eli did not have on the property and a trip into town to get them. He made the trip on a Wednesday, riding into Harrow Creek with a short list and a clear purpose, which was his standard approach to towns. He had learned that towns were easier when you moved through them with specific intent and did not linger. He tied the mare outside the general store, went in, gave the list to the man behind the counter, and stood waiting while the man gathered the items. There were 2 other men in the store, having a conversation that stopped when Eli came in and resumed after a moment at a slightly lower volume, which was not unusual. He was looking at a display of rope with professional interest when he caught a phrase he recognized. The name Hawkins. He kept his eyes on the rope. Voss offered her a fair price, one of the men was saying, in the tone of someone revisiting a long-established position. It's a smaller operation than she can sustain alone. Be better for everyone. She's not entirely alone anymore, the other man said. I heard she's got someone working out there now. Some drifter, the first man said. Won't last. They never do with a place that size. Eli turned from the rope and looked at the 2 men with the mild, unhurried directness of someone who has decided not to pretend he was not listening. The 2 men looked back at him, and there was the familiar moment, the eyes finding the scar, the brief recalibration. Good morning, Eli said. Morning, one of the men said after a small hesitation. He paid for his supplies and left. He was halfway back to the mare when a voice behind him said, Excuse me, and he turned to find a man of perhaps 50 standing in the doorway of the store, not one of the 2 he had overheard. You the hand working the Hawkins place? The man asked. Yes, Eli said. I'm Harold Freer, the man said. I knew Daniel Hawkins, good man. I just wanted to say Caroline's doing right by that land and right by his memory. It's good she's got help. Eli looked at the man. He had the plain face of someone who said what he meant. I'll tell her you said so, Eli said. Do that, Harold Freer said, and went back into the store. Eli rode back to the ranch with the supplies and the small, warm weight of what Harold Freer had said sitting in his chest beside the other things he was accumulating there without quite meaning to. The cow they could not save died on a Thursday morning quietly in the east pasture, and Eli was the one who found her. He did what needed to be done and then came back to the barn to find Caroline already there, having counted and found one missing in the way she always seemed to know. Which one? She asked. He told her. She closed her eyes for a moment, the brief, contained grief of someone who counts the death of an animal as a real loss without over-dramatizing it. I was afraid of that, she said. How's the other one? Better, he said. The treatment's working. She should be fine. She nodded. She was quiet for a moment, and he thought she was going to go back to the house, but instead she leaned against the barn door and looked out at the pasture where the rest of the herd was moving in their easy morning way, and she said, My husband would have known what to do for those 2 cows. He was good with the animals. Better with them than he was with people, he always said, but I think he was better with people than he admitted. She smiled slightly at something private. He was the kind of man who made you feel like you were the only person in the room without making it strange. Eli listened. I think James has some of that, she said. He makes friends easily, even with people he's just met. She glanced at him. Even with people who are not necessarily easy to make friends with. He looked at her. Is that a comment on me? A little bit of one, she said without apology. You hold yourself at a distance. I noticed it from the first day. You do your work, and you do it very well, and you're kind to my son, but you hold yourself back from everything by about 1 good step. He did not say anything to that, because she was right and they both knew it. I understand it, she said. I won't pretend I don't know why, but I want you to know that you don't need to keep that distance here, not with us." He looked at her for a long moment, standing in the barn doorway with the morning light coming in sideways past her and the quiet sounds of the pasture behind her. She was looking back at him with the directness he had come to expect from her, but there was something else in it this morning, something that was warmer than assessment without being anything he had a right to name yet. "I'll try," he said. "That's all I'm asking," she said, and went back to the house. He stood in the barn for a while after she left. He put his hand against the barn door frame, the old wood smooth under his fingers, and he thought that this was how it happened, not all at once, not in a rush, but steadily, the way good things happen, the way spring happens, 1 degree at a time until you realize the cold is gone. July came with a horse fair in Harrow Creek and Caroline decided to go, which meant James went, which meant Eli drove the wagon because she had not asked him to, but because it was the natural conclusion of the morning's logic when he saw her trying to do the complicated math of the wagon and James, and all the things she needed to accomplish in town in a single trip. "I'll drive," he said, and she looked at him and then at the wagon and then at James, who was already climbing up onto the seat with the air of someone who had already assumed this was the plan, and she said, "Fine." The fair brought half the valley into town, and the street was full of horses and wagons and the kind of cheerful noise that human gatherings make when the purpose is pleasure rather than business. James was in a state of barely contained excitement that he expressed by talking continuously about the relative merits of different horse breeds as they made their way through the fair, information he had clearly obtained from the natural history book. Caroline walked beside the wagon with her hand on the side rail and her face open in a way he had not seen before, the particular openness that comes from being in a familiar place among people you have known a long time. She greeted people by name, was greeted in return, and he watched her move through the community of the valley with a grace that was not about performance but about genuine belonging. Several people looked at him. He was past being troubled by it. What troubled him slightly was Gerald Voss, who materialized out of the crowd near the horse pens with the ease of a man accustomed to appearing where he intended to appear, and positioned himself beside Caroline with a familiarity that Eli watched from a careful distance. James appeared at Eli's elbow. "He's doing it again," James said. "Doing what?" "The thing where he stands too close and talks for too long," James said, with the precision of long observation. "Mama doesn't like it, but she's too polite to say so directly." Eli watched. Voss was talking with animated confidence, gesturing at something or toward something, and Caroline was listening with her arms crossed, and her weight shifted back in the way that meant she was not entirely comfortable. She was nodding at intervals, the way you nod when you are waiting for a conversation to end. Eli walked over. He did it without particular hurry or any deliberate intention of being threatening. He simply walked over because he had decided to step back from that one good distance of his, and in this context that meant standing beside the woman he worked for when a man she clearly wanted distance from was standing too close. "Caroline," he said when he reached them. Just her name, nothing loaded into it but placing himself at her side with the unhurried ease of someone who belongs there. She looked at him, and something moved briefly in her eyes that might have been surprise, or might have been relief, or might have been both things at once. "Eli," she said, "Mr. Voss was just asking about the north pasture fence." "That fence is solid," Eli said, looking at Voss with the mild, direct attention he gave to everything. "I rebuilt 3 sections in the spring. It'll hold." Voss looked at him, taking his measure with the quick competence of a man who was used to assessing things. His eyes moved over the scar with slightly less restraint than Caroline had managed on the porch, but they moved on. "You're the hand she's taken on," he said. "Eli Weston," Eli said. "You planning to stay?" Voss asked with a casualness that was not quite casual. "I'm employed here," Eli said with the same tone. The moment balanced itself briefly between them. Then Voss looked at Caroline with the studied warmth of a man who has decided to regroup. "I'll let you enjoy the fare," he said, and moved away into the crowd with the ease of someone who always moved away on his own terms. Caroline was quiet for a moment. Then she said, without looking at him, "Thank you." "I didn't do anything," he said. "You did something," she said, and her voice was quiet and without argument. They walked through the rest of the fair together, the three of them, and it was not at all unlike being a family, which was a thought Eli had and then looked at from several different angles for the rest of the afternoon without knowing what to do with it. On the drive home, James fell asleep between them on the wagon seat, his head eventually finding its way to Eli's arm with the unconscious trust of someone who has decided a person is safe. Eli looked down at the boy's sleeping face and then at Caroline, and she was already looking at him, and neither of them said anything. But the road ahead was very beautiful in the late afternoon light, and the valley was very green, and the silence between them was the kind that does not need to be filled. He thought he might be in love with her. He thought it the way you think a thought that you have been building toward for a long time without realizing it, all at once, and also not at all suddenly, like a door swinging open that you had been pressing against without knowing there was a room on the other side. He thought it, and then he thought about what to do with it, and the answer he arrived at was, nothing hasty. She was a widow with a child and a ranch and a careful life she had built from grief, and he was a scarred drifter who had showed up looking for work 6 weeks ago. The appropriate response to this particular revelation was patience and dignity and continued excellent fence repair. He was very disciplined about this for approximately 2 weeks. The thing that undid his discipline was not dramatic. It was a Wednesday afternoon in late July, and he had been helping her move a piece of furniture in the house, a heavy cabinet that needed to go against a different wall for reasons that made excellent sense when she explained them, and that he has since had some trouble reconstructing. The point was that they had moved the cabinet together, and in the final positioning of it, they had ended up very close together in the narrow space between the cabinet and the window, and she had turned to say something about whether it was level and found him right there, closer than either of them had meant for him to be, and they had been still for a moment in the particular stillness of proximity. She looked at him. He looked at her. The light through the window was the particular gold of a July afternoon, and she had a streak of dust across her cheekbone, and she was, he thought, the most real person he had ever stood near, and he was in love with her completely and had been for some time. "Is it level?" she asked, and her voice was entirely steady, but her eyes were not the same as her voice. "I'll check," he said, and moved back, and she moved back, and they checked the level of the cabinet with great professional attention and determined that it was slightly off and adjusted it, and then he went back outside. He walked to the far end of the north pasture and stood there for a while looking at the mountains. The mountains were not particularly helpful. He went back to work. August arrived, and with it a problem that was larger than fence posts or difficult cows or unwanted suitors. August arrived with news from a man named Cleaver, who was one of the neighboring ranchers and who came to the Hawkins place on a Friday morning with a face full of concern and a story about the water rights on the creek. The creek that ran along the southern boundary of the Hawkins property, the same creek that gave the valley its name, Harrow Creek, supplied water for 3 ranches, and there had always been an informal understanding about the use of it. But the Sutton Ranch, which had recently been sold to a new owner, had put in a diversion structure upstream that was pulling significantly more water than the informal understanding had ever intended, and the level downstream had dropped enough in the summer heat to be a concern. "It'll be a real problem come fall if the rains are light," Cleaver said. He was a direct man, rough-edged but honest, and he looked at Caroline with the respect of someone who disagreed with Voss about what a woman alone could manage. "And the new Sutton owner, fella named Albrecht, he's got papers that his lawyer drew up that he says give him priority on the creek water." Caroline's face was still and controlled in the way it was when she was most troubled by something. "Do you have a lawyer, Cleaver?" "I've written to one in Tucson," Cleaver said. I think if we go together, you and me and the Freer family, we have a better case than any of us has alone. That creek has watered this valley for 30 years, and no new deed ought to be able to override the common use of it." "I agree," Caroline said. After Cleaver left, she stood at the porch rail looking toward the southern pasture for a long time. Eli came and stood beside her. "How bad would it be?" he asked. "Bad," she said flatly. "The cattle need that water. In a dry fall without the creek at proper levels, I'd be looking at selling half the herd at the wrong time of year to reduce the water draw. That would gut the ranch." She paused. "Voss would know that, he probably already does." Eli looked at the pasture. He had been thinking about the creek since he first surveyed the property, had noted its level and the way the land ran toward it, had thought about it as an asset so reliable it barely needed consideration. The idea of it being taken was not abstract to him. "There's an alternative water supply," he said. She looked at him. "The spring on the northwest corner," he said. "I found it in April when I was checking the fence line. It's small now, but the flow suggests it's fed from a different source than the creek. If it's developed properly, a collection basin, maybe a pipe run to the north and west pastures, it wouldn't replace the creek, but it would reduce the dependence." She was quiet, looking at him. "You found a spring in April and didn't mention it." "I didn't think there was a reason to mention it until there was a reason," he said. "There's a reason now." The smile that crossed her face was small but real. "Show me," she said. They walked the northwest corner together that afternoon, and he showed her the spring, a quiet seep from the base of a limestone outcropping that gathered in a natural depression before making its way downhill. Exactly the sort of thing that gets overlooked because it does not announce itself. She crouched down and put her hand in the cool water and looked up at him with an expression that had calculation in it, but also something else, something warmer than calculation. "This could work," she said. "It could," he said. "It'll take some work to develop, a few weeks maybe if I have good weather and the right materials." "You know what to do?" she asked. "I've done it before," he said. "On the Double C there was a similar situation, spring up in the rocks, and I worked the collection basin myself. I can do it here." She stood up, brushing the damp earth from her palm. They were very close, the way you end up close when two people are both looking at the same small, important thing. She looked at him in the afternoon light, and he thought that something in her expression was different from its usual careful directness, that something had been shifting for a while now and was at some kind of edge. "Eli," she said, and then stopped. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, and he thought she was going to say something about the spring or the water rights or the ranch, but what she said was, "I'm glad you stopped here. Of all the ranches in the valley, I'm glad you stopped at mine." He looked at her, and it was the most full he had felt in 3 years. "So am I," he said. They stood there for another moment, and then she said very quietly, "Why did you come back in for the fourth man?" And he understood that this was not a non sequitur, that it was connected to everything she had been thinking about since he had told her the story in the barn. "Because I couldn't not," he said. "That's the only answer I have. I knew the roof was going to come down, and I went back in because I could not stand to leave without trying." She looked at him with those dark, direct eyes. "That's the kind of man you are," she said. Not a question, not a comfort. Just the plain statement of a thing she had decided. He did not know what to say to that. He did not say anything. But something between them had become clear in a way that it had been building toward for weeks, and they both knew it, and it was enough for the moment to know it together and let it be there. He started on the spring development the following Monday. It was good, straightforward work digging out the natural depression, lining it with flat stones he brought up from the creek bed, running a shallow trench to guide the overflow into a proper channel. James came and helped on the days when Caroline would let him, which was most days, and they worked in the companionable way they had developed over the summer. James talking about what he was reading and Eli listening and occasionally responding, and the work going steadily forward. Cleaver's letter to the Tucson lawyer came back with a favorable opinion. The lawyer believed that the long-established common use of the creek water constituted an implied easement that Albrecht's deed could not simply override, and was prepared to say so in the relevant official capacity if required. Caroline and Cleaver and Harold Freer signed the letter that went back to Albrecht's lawyer, and within 3 weeks Albrecht's diversion structure had been modified to restore the downstream flow. Voss came by once more in September, looking more measured than he had been in the summer, as if he had recalculated something. He sat on the porch with a cup of coffee that Caroline gave him because she was that sort of host, and he talked about the valley and the season and made no mention of buying the ranch. He looked at Eli with the evaluating attention of a man who has revised his initial assessment of a situation and found the revision inconvenient. When he left, Eli and Caroline sat on the porch in the quiet that followed. "He's not going to stop wanting it," she said. "No," Eli agreed, "but he's also not going to be able to get it. The ranch is in better shape than it was in the spring. The water supply question is resolved. The herd is healthy. There's no pressure point." She looked at him. "You've been thinking about this." "It's my job to think about what threatens this place," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you've been thinking about it?" she asked, and her voice had the same quality it had when she had said she was glad he had stopped here, the quality of something being offered honestly. He looked at her. The September evening was coming down around them, going golden and then amber, and the valley was laying itself out below the hills in its best late light colors, and he thought about a year ago, about the road and the roan mare and the valley he had almost not stopped in, and the woman on the porch who had looked at his face without flinching and said, "You'll do fine." "No," he said, "not only because of the job." She looked at him steadily. "I know," she said. "I've known for a while." And he said because this was the moment, and he was tired of stepping back from it. She looked out at the valley and then back at him, and her eyes were soft in a way that was entirely hers, not managed or withheld or performed, but just genuinely soft, the way things are when they are allowed to be themselves. "And I think Daniel would have liked you very much," she said. "He always admired men who went back in." Eli felt the weight and the gift of that sentence both at once. "I've been careful," she said. "I've been very careful since he died because I had to be. James needed me to be steady. The ranch needed me to be steady, and I've been steady." She paused. "But I am tired," she said, "of being only steady." He reached over and put his hand over hers where it rested on the arm of the chair, and she turned her hand over and held his, and that was all, and it was everything. James came out to ask about supper, and found them sitting on the porch holding hands and managed, with the extraordinary self-possession of a boy who reads a great deal, to go immediately back inside to fetch his own jacket, a mission that took him a remarkably long time. The autumn of 1878 settled over the Hawkins ranch with a beauty that felt to Eli like something the land was doing deliberately, though he knew better than to say so because it would have sounded foolish. The mornings were cold and bright, and the afternoons were warm, and the evenings came down slow, and the cattle moved through the changing pasture grass with their long, unhurried confidence, and the spring on the northwest corner produced its steady, quiet flow into the stone basin he had built, and everything that needed doing got done in its proper order. He and Caroline were careful about the new thing between them, careful in the way of two people who are not young or foolish, who know that what is real is worth protecting. There were evenings on the porch together after James was in bed, their chairs pulled close, talking about the ranch or James or the valley or the past in the honest way that they had always talked, but warmer now, with the new ease of people who have said the true thing and found it accepted. There were mornings when she brought coffee out to where he was working and stayed longer than the work required. There was a Sunday afternoon when James had gone to play with a neighbor's children, and they walked the whole perimeter of the property together, just the two of them, and she told him things about the years of building this ranch with Daniel that she had not told anyone, and he told her things about the years before the fire that he had not told anyone, and they walked and talked with the easy, thorough openness of people who have decided to know each other. One afternoon in October, she asked him about the future. They were sitting in the kitchen over the remains of a meal, James having gone to bed early with a headache, the lamp burning low and the autumn wind pushing at the window. "What do you want?" she asked. She was direct as always, but there was a vulnerability in the directness now, a willingness to receive an answer that might be difficult. Not just now, eventually. He looked at his hands and then at her. "I want to stay," he said, "if you'll have me." She was quiet. "That's a large thing," she said. "I know it." "James and I come with the ranch," she said, and there was a wry edge to it, but under the wry edge was the thing she was really saying. "We are not separable, he and I, and you need to know that." "I know that too," he said. "James is part of why I want to stay. He's a remarkable boy." She looked at him for a long moment. "And me?" she asked. "What am I?" He looked at her, at the dark eyes and the practical hair and the hands that had built and held and kept this place going, at the woman who had looked at his scarred face on a porch in April and seen nothing to be troubled by and said, "You'll do fine," with the full and specific weight of meaning it. "You're the reason," he said. Her breath was unsteady for a moment. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over his, the same gesture as the porch, the gesture that had become theirs. "I know," she said. "I was asking to hear you say it." "Then I'll say it as many times as you want to hear it," he said. She smiled, and the smile was the unheld, fully real version that he had been catching glimpses of since July, and that he now had the extraordinary privilege of seeing all at once. He asked her to marry him in November. He did it properly, which is to say he thought about it for 3 weeks and then told James first. James took this with the composure of a boy who had seen it coming since approximately August and had privately concluded that it was a good idea. "You should ask her," James said, with the judicial certainty of someone who had read several novels with this sort of development in them. "She'll say yes. I don't think she knows she'll say yes yet, but she will." "I thought you said she doesn't say things she doesn't mean," Eli said. "She doesn't," James agreed. "Which is how I know that when she says yes, she'll mean it." He asked her on a Sunday evening when the first real cold of the year had come down from the mountains, and the stars were very sharp and very close. They were on the porch, wrapped in the heavy blankets she kept there for exactly this season, and he had been waiting for the right moment and then decided that there was no perfect moment, only the moment you were in. "Caroline," he said. "Eli," she said. "I love you," he said. "I should have said that before the question, so I'm saying it now." She turned and looked at him, and in the starlight her eyes were very bright. "Marry me," he said. "This ranch, James, all of it, I want all of it. I want to work this land with you. I want to help you raise that boy right. I want to sit on this porch with you for the next 40 years and watch the valley change with the seasons." He paused. "I want to be the man who stayed." She was very still for a moment, and then she said, "Yes, Eli." Her voice was steady and warm and entirely certain. "Yes." He leaned forward and kissed her, the first time, careful and real, and she kissed him back with a surety that was entirely hers. And the stars were very clear above Harrow Creek, and the night was very cold, and neither of them noticed. They were married in December in the church in Harrow Creek on a day with a thin, bright layer of snow on the ground that made everything look new. Caroline wore a dress of dark blue wool that she had made herself with the help of the minister's wife, and she carried a sprig of dried winter herb that James had found in the garden and thought was the right sort of thing to carry. And she walked into the church with her chin up and her eyes clear, and she looked at Eli standing at the front of it, and smiled the fully open smile that he now knew was the real one. Harold Freer was there, and Cleaver and his wife, and Tommy Mullins looking proud to have been invited, and a handful of other valley people who had watched the season's developments with the particular interest that small communities always take in such things and who were, for the most part, genuinely glad. James stood beside Eli during the ceremony, which had not been formally arranged but which had happened naturally when they arrived at the church, James simply going to stand where he felt he should stand, and Eli had looked down at the boy, and the boy had looked up at him with the calm certainty of someone who has read enough stories to know when a good one is happening. It was, Eli thought, the best moment of his life. The winter was cold and close and very good. The three of them lived in the house together with the snug ease of people who fit, and Eli learned what it was to live inside a family rather than adjacent to one, and found that it was exactly as large and warm as he had always, in some locked-away part of himself, hoped it would be. James taught him something new from his books almost every day. Caroline was, in the privacy of their own life, both funnier and softer than her public manner suggested, and discovering both of these things was a continuous pleasure. He also learned that winter that James had known about the spring before Eli found it. "I found it the summer before Papa died," James told him one evening, looking thoroughly unrepentant. "I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure if it was big enough to be useful and because I didn't want Mama to worry about one more thing." Eli looked at him. "You were 9, he said. 9.5, James corrected. "You were protecting her," Eli said. "Someone had to," James said. And there was something in it that was not entirely a child's statement, that had the weight of the boy who had been listening through the wall to his mother, sitting quietly on the porch at night missing his father. Eli put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "You did a good job," he said. James looked at the fire. "You're doing a good job too," he said in a tone that was casual in the way that means the opposite. "A better job than I could do. I think that's all right." "It's all right," Eli said. "Papa would think so too," James said. "I think he would have liked you. Mama said so, and she doesn't say things she doesn't mean." Eli looked at the fire and thought about Daniel Hawkins, who had been a good man and who had built this place and raised this boy and loved this woman and died of a fever that was not the exciting kind. And he thought about what it meant to be trusted with someone else's everything and found worthy of it. He thought about it with the full weight of what it was, and he did not look away from any of it. Spring came back to Harrow Creek, and the valley turned green again, and the cattle were fat, and the new section of fence on the east boundary held through the winter without a problem, and the spring on the northwest corner ran clear and steady. Eli hired Tommy Mullins full-time because the ranch was doing well enough to afford a second hand, and because Tommy, for all his opinions about heifers, was a willing worker who improved with direction. James turned 12 in April and received, from Eli, a new volume on the history of the American West that had been published in 1876, and which James declared to be both accurate and in several places dramatically understated. Caroline told him she was expecting a child in May, on an evening when the weather was soft and the window was open to the night sounds of the valley. She told him in her direct way, her eyes on his face, watching for his response with the particular attention of someone who has learned that people's truest reactions happen in the first second before they remember to manage them. His first second was all light. "When?" he asked. "November," she said. "Near as I can tell." He stood up from the chair where he had been sitting and went around the table and crouched down to her level and took both her hands in his and looked at her. "Are you well?" he asked. "I'm very well," she said. "I've done this before. I know what I'm doing." "I know you do," he said. "I'm asking anyway." She looked at him for a moment, and her face was soft and open and real. "I'm well, Eli. I'm happy. I just wanted you to know." He lifted her hands and pressed them to his mouth, both at once, and said nothing because there was nothing adequate to say. And she laughed at the gesture, a low, warm sound, and put one hand against his cheek, the scarred cheek, with the same plain ease with which she had first looked at it on the porch, touching it as simply as if it were any cheek, as if it told no story she was troubled by. He closed his eyes for a moment. "You'll do fine," she said, and he could hear in her voice that she was smiling and that she was echoing herself deliberately, giving back to him the words she had given him the first day, completing something. "Yes," he said, "we will." James received the news about the new baby with thoughtful consideration. "I've read that older siblings have a significant influence on intellectual development," he said. "I intend to take that seriously." "I know you will," Caroline said. I also intend to teach it to read earlier than most children learn, James added. Studies suggest this is beneficial. The baby is going to be very lucky, Eli told him. Yes, James agreed without false modesty. I think so too. The summer was a good one by any measure. The herd had grown to 60 head, and Cleaver had offered to buy a portion of the cattle at a price that made the ledger look comfortable. The water rights were settled, the spring was developed and productive, the east fence was solid, and Eli and Tommy worked through the long summer days with the focused satisfaction of men doing work that matters for a reason they understand. He had not left the valley since his wedding. He had not felt the pull to. The road and the roan mare and the succession of closed doors had been the story of a man who did not yet know where he belonged, and he had found where he belonged, and the finding had been so complete that the old life of moving felt like something that had happened to someone else. He thought sometimes about the ranches that had turned him away, Dutton at the Barker place with his eyes sliding off the scar, the woman at the Calloway place who had called through the closed door, the boy at the Sutton gate. He did not think about them with bitterness, which surprised him. He thought about them with something closer to a complicated gratitude, because every closed door had pointed him to the one that had opened, and the one that had opened onto everything. He was mending a section of fence in early June when he looked up and saw Caroline walking across the field toward him with a canvas bag and a jar of water, and the summer light was full and warm, and she was carrying herself with the particular dignity of a woman in the middle of her life who knows who she is. And he thought that he would never be entirely accustomed to the luck of this, that it would never become ordinary to him, and that this was not a bad thing. She sat down on the fence rail beside where he was working and handed him the water and watched him work in the comfortable silence of people who do not need to fill all the space between them. After a while she said, "Harold Freer stopped by this morning. What did he want? To say that the Barker Ranch had a bad spring, lost a good portion of their herd to a sickness that went through the pasture." She paused. "He said Dutton's looking for hands." Eli looked at her. She was looking at him with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite a challenge, but something between the two. "No," he said. "I'm not asking," she said. "Just telling you what I heard." He looked at her for a moment. "You told me because you wanted to see my face when you told me," he said. "Maybe a little," she said, and the smile came through after all, the real one. "You're not even tempted." "No," he said. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." She reached over and touched his arm briefly in the way she sometimes did when words seemed beside the point. Then she said, "Tommy needs help with the north water line this afternoon. Can you get to it after this section?" "Yes," he said. "Good," she said. She stood up from the fence rail and gathered the canvas bag and looked at him in the morning light with those dark eyes that had never once flinched from his face, that had always taken him in whole without editing. "I love you, Eli Weston," she said, as plainly as she said everything. "I love you, Caroline," he said, the same way. She walked back to the house and he went back to the fence, and the summer lay out ahead of them like a good road. Their son was born on the 9th of November, 1879, in the bedroom of the Hawkins ranch house, in a snowstorm that had been building since the afternoon before, and that landed the valley under a foot of quiet white by the time the morning came. He was healthy and loud about it and had Caroline's dark hair, and as far as anyone could tell in the first hours of his life, Eli's stubbornness, which James announced with great authority was a positive trait in a ranching context. They named him Daniel James Weston. The Daniel was for Caroline's first husband, and Eli had suggested it himself, on a quiet evening before the birth when they were talking about names. She had looked at him when he suggested it with the expression of someone receiving something they had not expected to be given, and he had said, "He built something good here. It's right that his name goes forward." She had taken his hand and held it for a long time without speaking, and that had been enough. James was at the bedside when his half-brother was born, having argued successfully that he was old enough and informed enough on the relevant biology to be present. a case he had made primarily through citations from the natural history book, and a volume on frontier medicine that Caroline had not known was in the box. He held the infant with the careful solemnity of someone who takes responsibilities seriously, and looked at the small, furious face with an expression that was entirely, disarmingly tender. "Hello, Daniel," he said quietly. "I have a lot of things to teach you. We'll start with the easy ones." Eli stood at the bedside and looked at his wife holding their son and his son holding his brother, and thought that he had tried, at several low points in his life, to imagine what the far side of the hard years might look like, and that even in the best of those imaginings he had not gotten close to this. The winter settled in around them, and the Hawkins Ranch, the Weston Hawkins Ranch, as the valley had quietly begun calling it, was warm and full of light, and the sounds of a family that had built itself from grief and distance, and a door that had been left open. Gerald Voss sold his ranch the following spring and moved to New Mexico, which was not something anyone had predicted, but which everyone in the valley seemed to accept with equanimity. The man who bought it turned out to be a quiet rancher from Colorado named Beal, who was interested in his cattle, and not at all interested in acquiring his neighbor's property, which made him an excellent neighbor. He and Eli reached a working understanding within the first month over the question of shared fence lines, and Caroline pronounced him a significant improvement. James, at 13, began a correspondence with the Tucson lawyer who had handled the water rights case, having decided that the law was at least as interesting as natural history and considerably more useful in practical terms. The lawyer, a methodical man named Callister, wrote back with what James described as an encouraging level of seriousness. He had, by this point, read through the entire box of his father's books and begun working through a new collection that Eli had put together from the Harrow Creek store, and 2 separate orders from a bookseller in Tucson, which had arrived over the winter to James's complete and sustained delight. Tommy Mullins, who had turned 18 by summer, had become a genuinely skilled hand who understood cattle and fence and horses with an instinct that had grown considerably since the early days when he had held uncertain opinions about heifers. Eli worked alongside him with the patience he brought to teaching anything that mattered, and Tommy responded to it the way willing young men respond to being taught by someone who does not condescend to them. By the second spring, he was reliable enough to leave in charge of the morning rounds, which freed Eli for the larger planning work that the growing ranch required. Baby Daniel thrived in the specific, extravagant way of well-loved children. He was loud and determined and crawling by 7 months, and walking, unsteadily but with great conviction, by his first birthday, which he spent in the kitchen with flour on his face from an incident involving the bread preparation and a moment of unsupervised curiosity. He adored James with the uncomplicated totality of a younger sibling who has been given an older one who takes the job seriously. He regarded Eli with the calm, uncritical acceptance of a child who has never known anything else, which was its own kind of extraordinary thing to be given. He had, as he grew, Caroline's directness and Eli's stillness, a combination that produced a child who did not say much but who meant everything he said, which James declared was the best possible result. The ranch continued to grow. By 1881, the herd stood at 90 head, and Eli had added a proper cow barn with stalls for the winter months, built with Tommy's help over 2 summers. The spring on the northwest corner fed a second basin now, and the trench ran all the way to the west pasture, solving the water problem for that section entirely. The south fence had been fully replaced and painted and replaced again in 2 sections where the new wood had met with a wet spring badly, and the east fence was, at this point, the finest piece of fence line in the valley, which was a point of pride that Eli carried with quiet satisfaction. The valley itself had changed in those 3 years. New families had come in from the east and from Texas and from California, filling in the gaps between the established ranches with smaller operations, and eventually, a second general store and a schoolhouse that had been the project of 3 different women in the valley, working with the focused determination of people who understood that education is not optional. James walked to the schoolhouse every morning and came home with opinions about the curriculum that he expressed with diplomatic tact, and which were, more often than not, correct. Caroline stood on the porch on a November morning in 1881, exactly 2 years after Daniel's birth, and looked out at the valley with the particular attention she had always brought to it, the checking against interior image quality that Eli had first noticed in those early weeks. He came and stood beside her. "It looks different," she said. "Different how?" he asked. "Bigger," she said. "Wider. Not the land is the same, but it feels wider." She paused, choosing the word carefully in the way she always chose words when she was working something out. When Daniel died, the world got very small. Everything contracted to just what we had to do to survive. The ranch and James and the next day's work. I kept it going because I could not stop, not because I could see ahead. He looked at her profile in the morning light. "And now I can see ahead," she said. "That's the difference. Now I can look at this valley and see what's coming and it doesn't frighten me." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, the natural, easy lean of someone who has learned the shape of another person so thoroughly that the fitting is unconscious. "What do you see?" he asked. "James going east to study law," she said. "He's going to. He's already decided, he just hasn't said it out loud yet." She smiled. "Daniel learning to ride, which I give another year. Him arguing with James about the horse. The herd at 110, 120 by spring if the winter is decent." She paused. "You and me right here." "Right here," he agreed. "I see a good life," she said. "I see a full one." He held her, looking out at the valley in the morning light, the green hills and the creek and the good fence lines and the cattle moving in the near pasture with their easy, purposeful weight. From inside the house, he could hear James reading something out loud to baby Daniel, which was a sound he had come to love the way he loved reliable water and solid fence posts, and the smell of the land after rain deeply, practically, with the love that goes into things that are genuinely good. He thought about a morning in the spring of 1878, about a road and a tired mare and a valley he had almost not stopped in. About a scar and a succession of closed doors and the absolute conviction, by the end of a long day of rejections, that there was simply not a place in this valley that wanted what he had to offer. He thought about a porch and a woman with dark hair and a leather apron and brown eyes that looked at his face without flinching, without editing, without the familiar slide of discomfort that he had been bracing against for 3 years. He thought about the practical, specific weight she had put into 2 words that most people said without meaning anything at all. He looked at her now, standing in the circle of his arm with her eyes on the valley she had fought to keep, and he thought that she had always meant it. From that first moment on the porch, before she knew anything about him beyond what she could see and what his face said about reading cattle, she had looked at all of it and found it sufficient and said so, and he had spent the subsequent years discovering that this was exactly what she did. She looked at things whole, found what was truly there and named it plainly. It was the finest thing he had ever experienced, being truly seen. "Eli," she said. "Yes," he said. "Are you happy?" He looked out at the valley, at the green hills and the good water and the cattle and the fence lines and the barn with its fresh paint, at the life that had been built piece by piece from the moment she had left the door open. "Yes," he said. "Very much yes." She looked at him then, turned fully and looked at him with the direct, unheld gaze she had given him from the first day, that took in his face the scar and all the story it told, and all the story it got wrong, and found it not troubling, not remarkable, just fully and specifically his. "Good," she said, and meant it. The valley lay open around them, wide and green and full of the coming day. Inside, James was explaining the principles of common law to a 2-year-old who was probably not following the argument, but who was clearly enjoying the sound of his brother's voice. And the morning was coming in strong and clean through the open windows, and the cattle were beginning their slow morning drift toward the water, and the spring ran clear in the northwest corner, and the east fence stood straight and solid against the pale blue of the sky, and everything that had been broken had been mended, and everything that had been missing had been found. And Eli Weston stood on the porch of his home with his wife beside him, and thought that this, right here, was what all the roads had been leading toward, and that it was worth every closed door and every turned-away morning and every cold camp by every indifferent creek. It was worth all of it, completely, because here at the end of all those roads was Caroline, who had said you'll do fine and meant it, and she had been right.